Hello, human anatomy students. It is time for the thrilling conclusion to our unit on the cardiovascular system. And today is all about the number one killer. Do you know what the number one killer of Americans is? Take a guess. Cardiovascular disease. This is the number one killer of Americans at this point in time, and that point is so important I chose to use a red font on an orange background to really make that stand out. So let's talk about what cardiovascular disease is. The first major type of and so we're just going to go through the different types. The first one is atherosclerosis, and this really is at the root of just about every other type, not all, but most other types of cardiovascular disease. And what this is it's a buildup of fatty deposits in the walls of the arteries. And what I'd like you to do is pause this video, pull this slideshow up in the notes section of Schoology, and watch this animation. It does a really good job explaining this process and how this fatty deposit builds up. But here's the gist. Basically, something damages the lining of the artery, and we don't fully understand how that something damages it or why that something damages it. All we really know is that there are risk factors for having this damage, and we'll talk about those in a moment. At any rate, something damages the lining of the artery, and then cholesterol accumulates in that damaged area. Cholesterol is just kind of a sticky molecule and just kind of gets stuck in that little damaged part of the blood vessel. Now, your immune system recognizes there's a problem. It tries to go in and get rid of that cholesterol, but it doesn't do a great job and ends up kind of also accumulating in that damaged area, forming this kind of bulgy thing in the lining, and then calcium deposits in there, which hardens this accumulation into something which we call a plaque. And so here's a diagram of a nice, normal, healthy artery, and you can see blood flows very smoothly, nice, wide open diameter. Here is an artery affected by atherosclerosis. There's this plaque, this accumulation of cholesterol and immune cells and calcium and other minerals, and it hardens it, and so now blood can't flow through quite as well. And you can kind of see how this is problematic. We're going to get less blood flow to the areas that need it, and then that plaque can even clog up and eliminate blood flow, and we'll talk about what happens in that situation. So that's kind of the root of everything else we're going to talk about. The risk factors I mentioned, this is an actual coupon I found many years ago now, but it just so captured so brilliantly why this is the number one killer of Americans. This coupon says an entire meal for $10. And what is that meal? That meal is a frozen pizza, a pint of ice cream, and a 12-pack of Coke. If that is your idea of a meal, that is why you are at a high risk of atherosclerosis. So this is not a healthy choice. There's no fruits or vegetables in there, children. This is not a good idea. And largely, if you look at this list of risk factors, largely we have control over these risk factors. High cholesterol is a risk factor that is definitely linked strongly to diet. High blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, obesity, lack of physical activity. You have some degree of say over all of these based on how you live your life. Certainly there are genetic predispositions and things like that, but you got at least some wiggle room on these. The only two that you have absolutely no control over are age and family history. So the older you get, the higher risk you are, and then if you have a family history, genetics, that also obviously increases your risk. So let's talk about cardiovascular disease and some other more specific types. So coronary artery disease is a specific example of atherosclerosis where it affects very specifically the coronary artery. And so the coronary artery, you may remember, were the ones that line the surface of the heart, and their job is to provide oxygen and nutrients for the heart muscles themselves. And so if atherosclerosis happens in those coronary arteries, that is going to limit blood flow to the heart, and that obviously is very problematic. To make it worse, those coronary arteries are quite narrow, and so they're a little more at risk of this than other arteries, unfortunately. So there's different ways coronary artery disease can manifest itself. The first is angina, and angina is a partial blockage of the coronary artery. It's not completely blocked, but it is partially blocked, and that can lead to chest pain during periods of increased effort. So, good example in Minnesota, shoveling snow. You're out shoveling snow, you pick up that heavy shovel full of wet snow, and you go to throw it off to the side of the driveway. Your heart needs to pump a little bit more to handle that added exertion. Well, if you have a partial blockage, the heart's going to struggle with that, and then that's going to lead to some chest pain. And so, oftentimes people shoveling snow have this kind of like ugh in their heart. That is a warning sign that you should get yourself to a doctor or hospital to have that checked out. Um, Oftentimes, pain in the left arm is associated with this, and you might wonder, why would the left arm have pain? It's actually kind of an interesting case of a crossed signal. So the heart, if it's radiating out pain signals, it kind of radiates out these pain signals. And what happens is the nerve coming from the left arm picks up that pain signal and then sends it to the brain. And the brain, since it's getting the message from the left arm nerve, thinks, oh, the left arm must hurt. But it's simply that pain radiating out kind of crossing over and tripping this particular neuron and causing it to send a message to your brain. So pain in the chest, pain in the left arm, two pretty big warning signs that something might be wrong with your heart, and you should definitely get that checked out sooner rather than later. Left alone and not dealt with, angina can progress to a heart attack. Now, a heart attack is a complete blockage of the coronary artery. So angina was a partial blockage. This is a complete. And now the muscles that are downstream of that blockage are going to start to die. And so you can see we have a blockage here. The blood can't get through. And so all these muscle cells are no longer able to get the oxygen and nutrients they need to stay alive, and they're going to start to die. And that's what this kind of blackened part of the heart is. And once those cells die, muscles are like neurons. They don't come back. And so this is definitely something to be avoided. By the way, I have some animations. Feel free to click on these and check them out if you want more detail on this, but they're not as critical as that first one that I sent you to. Now, if there's not enough blood flow to the heart, what do you think is going to happen to that ECG, that nice atrioventricle, atrioventricle, atrioventricle pattern of the heartbeat that we had? I'm guessing you're thinking it's going to not work as well, and you're right. A heart attack can oftentimes lead to cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest is different from a heart attack. Heart attack is that blockage. Cardiac arrest is a malfunction of the heart's electrical system. And this obviously causes the heart to stop working because that electrical system is what's regulating that steady contraction of the heart. Atrioventricle, atrioventricle, atrioventricle. If this electrical system isn't working properly, then that rhythmic pumping of the heart doesn't happen. So no, this can be caused by a heart attack, but it doesn't have to be caused by a heart attack. For example, if you're electrocuted or something like that, struck by lightning, that could lead to cardiac arrest and disrupt that electrical system. So not always caused by a blockage, but commonly is. So to just kind of recap how this all works, normally what I do at this point is I try and demonstrate the problem with a heart attack and cardiac arrest. And so imagine we're in the classroom and I point to roughly a third of the students in the room, and I ask them to represent cells of the atria, these two chambers at the top of the heart. I then point to the other 2/3, and I say, you are going to represent cells in the ventricles, these bottom two chambers. Now, why do you think I have more students to represent the ventricles than the atria? Do you know? It's because the ventricles are bigger and have more muscle. And then I also want you to remember that if we're representing cells of the muscle, remember the shape of muscle cells? Hopefully you remember spaghetti noodles. Remember my model of the spaghetti noodles? So basically each student represents a spaghetti noodle that makes up the muscular walls of the heart. Roughly a third of the students representing the atria, the other 2/3 represent the ventricles. I then carry out the role of the SA node, the heart's natural pacemaker. And I simply point to each group of students and they say pump. So I point to the students who are acting as the atria. They say pump. And the ventricles, pump, 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 pump. And because of this nice steady rhythm, when the atria contract, pump, we get that nice little P wave. When the ventricles contract, pump, we get that nice little QRS complex. And then the T wave represents the recovery of the ventricles. So we have this nice system, right? Pump, 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 pump. From the lungs to the heart, to the body to the heart, from the lungs to the heart, to the body to the heart, from the lungs to the heart, to the body to the heart, right? It's all just jamming and grooving and everything's moving all beautifully and smooth. And that is how we're supposed to be, right? Your heart cells are working together and they're coordinating the movement of blood from the body to the heart, to the lungs to the heart, from the body to the heart, to the lungs to the heart. And away we go. So now let's introduce coronary artery disease. What happens is we end up experiencing what is called fibrillation, which is a loss in the coordination of the heart muscle fiber contractions. That EKG or ECG, instead of that nice P wave QRS complex, it's just chaos. It's anarchy here. The electrical activity is all screwed up. Why would that be? Well, what happens is in the event of coronary artery disease, the heart isn't getting the oxygen and nutrients it needs to do its job. Cells start to die, and they can't work together to pump the blood how they're supposed to do. And so as a result, this time I say, okay, class, same deal as before. I'm going to be the SA node. I'm going to try and conduct you, boom, pump, pump. But this time, everybody ignore me. So students just say pump whatever you want. So I'm like, hey, pump everybody, come on, I'm the SA node. And basically the students are ignoring me and they're like pump, 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 pump. And it's just chaos and anarchy. And that's what happens. Doctors refer to the heart in this state like a bag of worms, because all those little muscle fibers, instead of working together, boom, to contract the heart, it's just all the little spaghetti noodles that make up the wall are working independently, and they just kind of contract all willy-nilly. This is obviously a bad thing because now you're not getting blood to go from the lungs to the heart, to the body of the heart, from the lungs to the heart, to the body of the heart, because the heart isn't doing its job. And this is a real problem. And so what I'm going to do is pause here, and in part 2, we'll figure out, okay, how do we fix this? What do we do when someone's heart is fibrillating, and how do we bring them back?